And the world needs to know, because the information they don't have about Africa in America and other Western world is one of aid, one of squalor, one of poverty, one of religious crisis. They need to begin to see that Africa is a continent of economic opportunities, a lot of potential. Absolutely. And that returns on investment in Africa is huge.
Tony Elumelu is clearly passionate when it comes to African investment. He feels Africa's private sector, along with the international community, can make a tremendous impact on the continent's economic status. He's even coined a name for the philosophy. Let's get into that concept of Africapitalism. What is it? How does it work? What's the idea?
From interacting with customers, with communities, with local governments, state governments, and nation governments, I started to see a pattern that indeed we can, as a private sector, help to develop Africa in a manner that is truly sustainable. I also, as a good student of economic history, have observed the development of the African continent and come to realize that, despite all the aid inflows into Africa, and despite our sovereign government's commitment, our commitment to developing the continent, not much was achieved. But I saw through our little interventions, through our little long-term $5 million investment, how it has helped to create over 25,000 jobs across the continent, how it has helped to facilitate payments across the continent, how it has helped to power SMEs, small scale and medium enterprises across the continent. And I'm like, okay, if we can do more of this, if we can mobilize the African private sector and non-African private sector operating in Africa to think long-term, to invest long-term in Africa, in key sectors, then we might end up creating economic wealth, economic prosperity, and social wealth. That is Africapitalism.
Well, when you look at the private sector in Africa, let's say before, or maybe even at this point, where are they investing?
The private sector in Africa was largely dependent on government patronage, the government contracts, but today it has changed significantly. You have the private sector in Africa today that is adding real value to the economy through engagement in payment systems, through engagement in key infrastructure projects, through engagement in manufacturing and processing of raw materials in Africa and exporting this within the continent. So it's a shift, a significant shift from where the private sector was before to where it is today. And we're beginning to see a new crop of private sector people in Africa who believe and understand that they have a role to play in the development of the continent.
In 2010, Elumelu founded the Nigerian-based investment company Heirs Holdings. When U.S. President Barack Obama announced his Power Africa initiative earlier this year, the company showed support of the movement by making an enormous pledge.
Heirs Holdings, through one of our operating entities, Transco, Transnational Corporation of Nigeria, invested $300 million to acquire the largest power plant in Nigeria under the current government privatization program. And subsequently, when President Obama launched the Power Africa initiative, we committed that we invest up to $2.5 billion. That is additional $2.2 billion to the $300 million we have already invested. It is not just for Nigeria. It's investment in the power sector across Africa. Because we understand as Africapitalists the importance of power, access to electricity in unleashing the economic potential of Africa. Because of that, we felt if we preach, since we preach that the private sector should do long-term investment in Africa, in key sectors, there's no sector at this point in time to us that is as strategic as power sector in dealing with the issue of economic empowerment, democratization of economic prosperity across the continent than power. And that is why we have committed to doing additional $2.5 billion, not just in Nigeria, but across the continent.
How do you, as I would say, almost a representative of business in Africa, how does Africa compete, and what can it do better than other parts of the world?
Comparative advantage and the competitive edge that Africa has to offer. China, for instance, engages with Africa with Africa, not as a bloc, but they deal with different countries, 54 countries in Africa. That doesn't give Africa the competitive tool or edge to negotiate better. The rest of the world, they do the same thing with Africa. So we want to see an Africa that is together, and we can speak with common voice and say, no, what's important to Africa is not aid. What's important to Africa is that we want to have regional infrastructure like road running from Cape Town to North Africa. That what's important to us is not necessarily about intra-Africa trade today, but that we need to deal with this of processing, value-adding services, value-adding industries that can take advantage of the natural endowment and resources that we have on the continent, which is a competitive advantage that we have. So we are working together to see how, as a continent, we can identify the 20% of our needs that can create 80% value to the entire continent.
So you look into the future. What are your goals for the future?
My goals for the future are twofold. One is personal, and two is about the continent. And so for personal goal, I like to continue to impact humanity, because you get to a certain level where you wake up in the morning not necessarily because you want to earn a living. You wake up in the morning and you think about impact, about legacy. What am I? How people? What impact am I going to leave behind? And so, as I look at the African continent, I tell myself, this is a continent that is about to explode, but lacks certain vital ingredients. And so what role can I play in making sure that some of those challenges were addressed in my lifetime, so that my children will not ask the kind of question I asked of my parents and grandparents, that where were they when the war started? So that is important to me. That is why we invest in power. Not just because we want to make more money, which is good, but because we touch life significantly making that money.